year on afloat with the launch of an interesting paper about a green Ministry of Green Works, and we jumped at it. And I'm really pleased to have this session put together so quickly. And we'll go through a process. I think with Ed talking a little bit about the fact that the First Union commissioned the development of the paper, that Max and Jackie worked on it, and Vanessa, you got involved in as well, I think, as a contributor. So let's start off then, if you like, with Ed, just talking a little bit about the First Union's thinking behind putting this project together. Ed.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you very much. Well, everybody here, particularly the Fabians and Max for putting this event together. I'm Edward Miller. I'm the researcher at First Union. And for those of you that don't know, First Union, we're, I guess, the second largest private sector union. We represent workers in the retail, finance, commerce, transport, logistics, and manufacturing sectors. And we're pretty active. I guess we call ourselves a social change union. You know, we're not just trying to service our membership, but trying to think of what policies government should be pursuing and how workers can be active in pursuing those kind of policies to ensure that we have a better future and a better opportunity to thrive for all people. This report came out, I mean, I'm really happy to be talking about this report, least of all because as a researcher, I didn't have to write it, which is a real pleasure for me, but quite a task for Jackie and Max to step into, but they more than fulfilled the responsibilities there. For the last couple of years at our delegate forums, we've sort of spoken to our members about what the biggest issues were for them outside of the workplace. Obviously, we deal with workplace issues all the time, but consistently the response that's come up in I'd say 90% of the country has been united on the fact that housing is the biggest issue. The only area where housing hasn't consistently been the biggest issue is where I am, Taitokoro, where methamphetamine has come up, you know, pretty close. But housing has always been raised as a major issue. The cost of purchasing houses, the cost of rent, the struggle to get in, the issues with tenants' rights, not being able to stay in houses and that kind of thing. Before the COVID crisis, you know, it become pretty clear that housing had become effectively a speculative asset for a lot of people, and that working people really struggled to be able to get access to housing, access to protection, access to their rights. But when the COVID crisis hit, this sort of skyrocketed. Our union, in response to the COVID crisis, broadly called for an all-of-government response, and we started a campaign called A Future That Works. Parts of that campaign included a demand for full employment, obviously decent wages and conditions, but also stronger worker democracy, and crucially also for a more active state intervention role in the economy. And one of the key proposals of amongst that agenda was to call for the re-establishment of the old Ministry of Works. So we're excited to see how it's evolved into a Ministry of Green Works through the work of Max and Jackie. I think it's been quite clear that while there's good things about the government's COVID response, that there have been some pretty troubling things, particularly in the housing space, and the Reserve Bank's monetary response really has supercharged inequality in the housing space in a way that we hadn't really imagined before. I was reading just before that in the 18 months since the COVID crisis began, the value of New Zealand's housing stock has increased by $549 billion. Yeah. You know, that's 3 times the size of the stock exchange, and it's probably equivalent to GDP over that 18-month period. Homeowners themselves, those lucky enough to own a home, have benefited from a 35, 40, maybe even 50% increase in the value of their house, but people struggling to get into the market have been put in an extraordinarily difficult position. Renters have faced skyrocketing rents, and those people in even more unfortunate circumstances trying to get into public housing have faced extraordinarily difficult situations. Despite ongoing reforms and attempts to incentivize housing construction, it seems that the industry is at basically maximum capacity right now, and prices are continuing to rise at a pretty alarming rate. it's our view from First Union that it's only through a major agenda of public investment of this kind of scale that we haven't seen since the Great Depression that we'll be able to get working people into a situation where they can access housing and live a decent life. The re-establishment of the public housing estate particularly is a crucial part of the puzzle that's been largely ignored in the debate up till now, but Max and Jackie are really bringing that back, and we're really proud to have been providing a space in which that discussion can take place. So I'm very happy to see that. And on a personal level, this work to me is really, really important. I came back to Aotearoa in July last year after having spent 5 years in Kuala Lumpur, where I was working with construction and wood and forestry unions across Southeast Asia and South Asia. And it really frustrated me that my comrades in Cambodia and Myanmar had a union that could organize construction workers, where here in Aotearoa, we don't really have an active union that's in a position to organize construction workers at all. And we don't have a head start on being able to do that with some kind of state intervention. Prior to that, I guess my first job in the trade union movement, I worked really closely with Helen Kelly on the Forestry Safety Campaign. I'm sure a lot of you will have followed that campaign. It was tragic to see that despite the ongoing efforts of people like Helen and a whole bunch of people working in that space, that workers continue to die at an alarming rate because of this industry. But perhaps an even greater tragedy is the fact that the vast majority of timber that we extracted here from our forests was not actually used for the benefit of working people here in Aotearoa, but most of it was sent to China to be used as concrete formwork. You know, we're essentially enabling the Chinese construction industry just to build more shopping malls and highways, rather than addressing the pressing social deficits that we have in this country. So I'm sure that with a bit of proper coordination of the supply chain, there's immense potential to be able to fill those gaps, to be able to align the resources, the assets, the skills that we have. But we need coordination, we need training. And I think within the space of this Ministry of Greenworks, there's a huge potential to be able to do that while we tackle the problem of climate change. So I'm very happy to be able to, I guess, introduce Max and Jackie and get them to talk about their proposal. I think, you know, it's a time of massive upheaval, massive social upheaval. And it's time for the state to take a greater role in the management of the economy. And while some people may balk at the cost of setting up a Ministry of Greenworks or something like that, I think the costs of inaction right now are many, many times greater. So I'd just like to say that we're very grateful to have this work and pass on to Max and Jackie to tell us a little bit about their proposal.
Wow.
Kia ora, tēnā koe, Ed. Ka pai, tēnā koutou katoa. Firstly, yeah, thank you so much to Phil and the team for having us this evening. Really grateful to be able to have a space to share about this work. And again, to First Union who, you know, commissioned us to do the work, which has been really great in terms of partnership for the specific work that we'll share today. Yeah, and thanks to everyone who've joined us today. Really great that we could share with this and, you know, bounce ideas and have a really good discussion about what we've proposed. I thought I'll just keep our introductions really short. So just firstly, ko waio, hiuri tēnei no ngā tika nuni ki re taunga, ngā tutu whare tō me ngā pui hoki. Ko Jacqueline tōku ingoa. So kia ora, my name is Jacqueline. My parents whakapapa have ancestral ties to many different parts of the North Island, but I'm currently based in Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland. My background is in landscape architecture and planning. My full-time job, I'm based over at Unitec. I do a lot of the national science Māori housing research, which is government funded research for the research centre, and I teach part-time in the School of Architecture there. So a bit of mixed work on the full-time role. Additionally, I'm appointed to the Urban Development and Planning Committee for Kainga Ora Homes and Communities, which is more supporting their delivery functions in terms of governance. I've recently returned back to Aotearoa and have worked with the Public Services Commission on some open government stuff, just really improving, you know, public participation and accountability and transparency, etc. And have recently joined the Human Rights Commission actually to work on the National Housing Inquiry to support the Chief Commissioner and their team on that work. So really kind of grateful to work across many spaces in the housing space, and being able to, really think about the significant gaps, especially within the current institutional framework, and think about what they might look like in terms of how we address these and respond to these issues. So just a really brief background. And so, yeah, that's kind of how I ended up working with Max on this. So it was really new space for me, actually, in terms of the union sides and really understanding the issues that workers face, but really important as well. So not only growing the knowledge that I'm able to attain in this space, but actually how I can continue to think into that space across, the diverse spaces that I work in. So actually really such a grateful honor to be able to contribute to this piece specifically. So that's enough about me, but I'll just quickly pass it over to Max to, just perhaps intro before we get stuck in.
Thanks.
Kia ora koutou katoa. I'm sorry, just was on mute there. The common Zoom introduction. Ko Max Harris tōku ingoa. He Pākehā aho, he Tauriwi aho, ko Tamaki Makoto aho e noho ana e mahi ana. My name's Max. I'm Pākehā. My family's from Scotland and Wales and England. And I'm, like Jackie, based in Tamaki Makoto, Auckland. I also, like Ed, spent quite a long time overseas and just returned to New Zealand this year. I did a mixture of political work and study overseas, law and public policy, at quite an interesting time in the UK when there's a real push towards more progressive economic policy in particular. And I won't say too much more, just to say I have sort of family connections to this work as well. I have a twin brother who's a house painter and a younger sister who works in housing policy, and was lucky to talk to both of them in the writing of this report. I also just wanted to thank the Fabians for hosting this discussion, for being a great space for progressive debate, and in particular to thank First for making this report possible. And a special thank you to a few people who contributed in particular to this report, which you can read online. So Vanessa Cole, who's going to speak later, who did a lot of work on public housing for this, Wilbur Townsend, who did some costings work, Peter Rice and Tamayo Stewart, who did some work on structuring the ministry, and Jen MacArthur. So this was a real team effort. And we're going to speak, I think, for about 40 to 50 minutes. Then we're going to throw it over to Vanessa, who will speak for 5 to 10 minutes on kind of related campaigns going forward. And I'll throw it over to Jackie to say a little bit more about the background now.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Max.
Oh, okay, so we'll hopefully fly through it. So get ready, knowing that we've not got a lot of time, but a lot of work to get through. So firstly, just as a brief overview to kind of contextualize where this piece of work sits. So last year, both myself and 2 other authors, Jordan King and Jen MacArthur, during the first kind of lockdown, and we probably need better hobbies, we decided to collaborate and write a paper which is called Transformative Housing Policy in Aotearoa New Zealand. Many of us were both based in New Zealand and the UK, and had nothing better to do, but got together in terms of like minds and thought about some of the things that we could contribute in terms of public policy and the discourse and debate, essentially. But also we noted many proposals which you can have a look and access online. One of those were the Ministry of Works, and what might that look like, and how can we continue to build on the existing pieces of literature, etc. Out there. There are other policy ideas, but for this specific work, we're going to focus on that development and the evolution of the Ministry of Works, and now how we've got to this kind of idea of a Ministry of Green Works, and really reimagining what that looks like for the 21st century. So Max had just kind of reached out. We were in the UK, and then we switched places, UK and New Zealand, and then I'd moved there, and then he'd moved back, and reached out to essentially ask if I wanted to work on this. And given the work that I guess the spaces that I work in across both housing and urban development, I was really keen to get involved to think about, how we can address this gap, and what does that look like, especially given, the demand for homes for our communities, the need for infrastructure and the support, given our population is going to continuously grow rapidly. So it really kind of prompted the key questions that we started thinking about. We know we are in a housing crisis. And I think some may have seen today's report, again, housing being one of the most important pressing issues in Aotearoa. But how can we build houses? You know, what's working and what's not working? And how do we kind of move beyond the failures of, you know, issues like outsourcing and contracting out? And I guess the current conditions, even more so, are forever changing, and especially during COVID, right? We know that the dire need is still there before the pandemic, it is now, and it will still be post-pandemic, whatever that looks like. Really, again, thinking about, and I know Max mentioned it before, around understanding homes and houses as a concept and the way in which they're valued and how they're an asset and a basic need for many other people. So, you know, what are some of these values that we share? How can these inform and guide our priorities? And what is the collective approach that we need to, you know, take in order for us to really build homes, strengthen communities, challenge mainstream approaches that are not working, and some of these practices even more so. So, you know, does our current housing system or institutional framework, is it really set up to serve the needs of our communities? In our opinion, not at this stage. We're still relying on the market or the private sector to be able to deliver. So that's quite problematic in our opinion. But I guess it gives, you know, more emphasis to this idea of a Ministry of Green Works and how it can essentially consolidate a lot of the expertise that is required. It is so fragmented in its current state. So let's explore what that might look like.
Yeah, and as Jackie alluded to, over COVID times, I think we had lots of people talking about rethinking our values and rethinking our society. And one line that was often quoted was the Indian writer Arundhati Roy saying the pandemic could be a portal into another world. But it wasn't just activists and dreamers who identified that the pandemic should prompt us to renew our institutions. In fact, New Zealand's Minister of Finance, Grant Robertson, said in a speech in May 2020, what we have here on the slide, actually some quite big picture challenges here. He said we should all acknowledge that things weren't perfect before COVID-19 hit us. I'm not going to read the whole quote, but he also said there were ways in which we had not reached the standards we aspire to as a country. We're not quite the nation we like to think we are, he said, and said that now's the time to address these long-term issues and that this is not a privilege we should squander. If your house were to burn down, he asked, you probably wouldn't build it back exactly the same, would you? And I think we still need to ask these questions 18 months on from this speech that the Minister of Finance gave before the budget in 2020. And Jackie and I wanted to ask these questions like, what can we do now to build back differently to plug the gap between the country we aspire to be and the country we are? And just to say a bit about how we did this. So Jackie and I have a background in research and a lot of this work was desk research, but one exciting part of this project was interviewing 20 or 25 people that we identified as important thinkers and activists in housing infrastructure and climate change. And one thing that I really enjoyed was talking to a lot of people that had been around during the old Ministry of Works who had stories that I think are perhaps too easily forgotten and stories that we wanted to combine with new thinking about where our country should move. So now I'm going to pass back to Jackie to talk about the first part of our paper, which is about learning lessons from the past before going into the present.
Absolutely.
Awesome. So I'm just going to provide a really brief overview and you can avidly read the report in your own time or if you haven't already. And so within this specific section, we discuss three really key components as identified to really understand the social, cultural and urban fabric of housing and infrastructure in Aotearoa. We go back to prior to European arrival and highlight that Māori had their own vernacular architecture, marae, pa or village settlements, you know, food resources, and all these aspects are embedded in the notion of kainga, essentially, from using waka, understanding tribal economies, and really hiding the key foundations that existed within our communities and villages. We discuss the obvious, you know, the impact of colonization and the major impact that that has had on our landscapes, our places, and our environments. We highlight different periods over time as has evolved, the societal influences that have really shaped and determined infrastructure and development in Aotearoa. We unpack these to some extent, these ideas in connection with colonial power and governments. We also note the major impact the Ministry of Works, that had on Māori communities, which is well documented, although some may also argue that there were many good things actually that aren't actually documented. So we heard some of those stories as well through the process, but obviously this has such a huge impact on the current conditions that Māori in that context have experienced today. And so I think even, for myself, it was interesting going through this process because I've been able to specialize in such area, but I was always continuously learning too, to understand, this is why this has happened or why this hasn't happened, and has really influenced just the conditions, even more so, I would say, for our generation today, but also quite alarming and a little bit scary for, the next generation to come. So it gives, I guess, even more so a reason to do something about it. So that was a really good kind of experience, even just for myself to go through. Max will talk about some of the other key points that are in the learning lessons from the past.
Yeah, so as Jackie said, what we really wanted to do was draw on some of the really good work that's out there about what the Ministry of Works did. There are two really good histories of the old Ministry of Works, one by Rosalind Noonan, called By Design, and another by Jim Muir called Opus Works. But what we wanted to do was combine those stories with what we know about some of the negative impact of Ministry of Works, in particular on Māori. And we were lucky to speak to both Rosalind and Jim. And yeah, I just wanted to add three further points that came out of kind of thinking about the past. One was thinking more positively about the Ministry of Works, the versatility of the ministry. So the fact that the ministry produced things from roads to rail, from housing to hydro, from bridges to tunnels, hospitals, quarantine stations, lighthouses, government and university buildings, in some cases even towns. We also heard about the shifts over time from the old Ministry of Works. And so the Ministry of Works was first set up in 1870, became, as the Public Works Department, became the Ministry of Works in 1943 and was expanded to become the Ministry of Works and Development in the 1970s. And what we really saw over time was the way in which different governments shifted and what their focus was through the Ministry of Works and its various carnations. So different governments relying on contracting out to different extents. In the 1890s, the Liberals really seeing the Ministry of Public Works Development as it then was as a construction agency. In 1949, the national government shifting away from that, encouraging people to build their own homes. And these shifts over time, where progressive governments tended to focus on housing, for example, and other governments focused on other priorities. Another important point to come out of these histories was that the Ministry of Works in its various forms was quite innovative. It retrained soldiers after the Second World War. It partnered with architects, as we're going to talk about a bit later. It had an experimental engineering lab at a later point in the 20th century. It even had a computing center before computers were normal. And many major buildings that we see around the country now were Ministry of Works projects, some of which have a very colonial imprint. And there are some examples here: the Victoria University Law School in Wellington, Britomart Station in Auckland on the left. Of course, there were major shifts in the 1980s, which led to the demise of the Ministry of Works. And these have been well written about by people like Jane Kelsey. Won't go through those changes in detail now. Many of you will be familiar with them. It's enough to say the 1980s and 1990s saw an intensification of the capitalist characteristics of the New Zealand economy. And so we saw key services sold off, including banks, telecommunications, and rail, move towards light touch regulation, a move to the public service being remodeled under new public management, where public servants, and this is important to the story we're going to tell, public servants being seen as managers rather than experts, and the public service really being reconceptualized along corporate lines. Taxes were cut, unions decimated through the Employment Contracts Act, benefits cut in the mother of all budgets in 1991, and often debt being used as an argument for why the state needed to be reduced. But what of course happened was, despite the rhetoric of the small state, what really happened was that the small state rhetoric was applied selectively in a way that meant that certain sectors actually flourished at this time. Sectors like real estate and insurance, what Jane Kelsey calls the fire economy, finance, insurance and real estate. But what we saw in this time was a shift in values most fundamentally. And we heard about this from Sid Kepper, who we spoke to, and who talked about how even the very idea of what a successful life is in New Zealand shifted, in his view, in the 1980s and 90s, from a model of kind of collective care in the community to a model of individual aspiration and individual success. As part of those changes in the 80s, public institutions were dismantled. And this included major public science institutions like DSIR, the Development Finance Corporation, which was a kind of public investment bank, and the Ministry of Works, which was commercialized in 1987, turned into an SOE, state-owned enterprise, in 1988, and then sold off fully in 1996. We spoke to Len Cook, who was the head of who's the chief statistician in New Zealand, and he told us, we destroyed an approach, the belief that public servants were critical to the future of New Zealand. So those are some of the lessons that we drew from the 80s, and obviously this had many long-running effects, including the leaky homes crisis, which came from light touch, in part from light touch regulation of homes. And one point just to make here is I worked in the courts in my first job outside of university, and it was very interesting to see judges who are usually very cautious actually being quite forthright about how the legislative framework that was set up in the early 90s, the Building Act, was instrumental in being directly causally related to the leaky homes crisis that we're still all affected by now. So those are some of the lessons we learned from the past about early approaches to housing and infrastructure, through Māori history, right through to lessons from the history of the Ministry of Works and lessons from the 80s. Now I'm going to move into problems in the present, and I'm going to talk about the first two that we identified, and then I'm going to throw it over to Jackie to talk about the third and fourth problems we identified. So these were four kind of themes that came out of our discussions. And the first problem is the problem of capacity. So this, Ed already alluded to this. This is the idea that the private sector is at capacity in its attempts to build. And we've seen Treasury advice to this effect, but we also saw the private sector saying that there isn't enough capacity to build more. And this is a real public policy challenge, that we have a private sector that says it can't do anything more, while at the same time there's real unmet housing need, with the public housing wait list ticking over just recently to 25,000 people. And one graph that I think really highlights this public policy challenge and problem is this graph that we found from the Productivity Commission's 2012 report. And actually Len Cook put us onto this. And the line that's sloping upwards is the housing investment dedicated to the upper quartile of housing. And the line sloping downwards is the housing investment dedicated to the lower quartile. And what you see here is gradually over time, this shift in housing investment focused on essentially the upper quartile, those wealthier homeowners, and a gradual neglect of those in real housing need. And you see a particular shift in the 80s. And this highlights this problem, the structural problem in our housing sector, where a housing sector that's been increasingly reliant on private investment and private construction is not supplying housing need. The second problem, just to mention briefly, is the problem of contracting out. And this arose in a number of people that we talked to. So we've long had contracting out in government construction, I mentioned that earlier, but it has become the dominant public model for housing and infrastructure. And this came about in particular under that new public management approach that I described earlier, where government became began to see itself just as managing contracts rather than as experts or doing direct delivery. So we see Kāinga Ora now having a dominant model where it contracts out. So when we hear about Kāinga Ora building houses, what's actually going on is Kāinga Ora draws up a contract using consultants and legal experts, and it's getting third parties, often for profit, delivering and building houses. That's contracting out. It's happening in construction. It's happening in services around construction for managing and maintaining and operating infrastructure. And contracting out, of course, promised in particular in the 80s, greater efficiency, greater accountability. The idea was that when you have private sector operators competing for contracts, that you get the most efficient providers and that you get contracts that would hold people to accountable rather than distant government, which wasn't disciplined by the market. And we were also promised innovation through contracting out, that private sector operators competing with each other would bring new ideas and exciting new approaches, that the profit motive supposedly would ensure creativity and experimentation. But we've seen limited evidence of accountability and efficiency and innovation. And that's really what Jackie and I found in the interviews that we did and the research that we did. We see this in the failures of the transmission gully public-private partnership, but that's not just a bad apple. It's a problem that we see replicated across the board. And we saw patterns in the studies that we reviewed, patterns where competitive tendering has lowered performance. Wages have been reduced over time, which is particularly worrying from a worker perspective. A loss of know-how, and this is really crucial, where as projects are contracted out, all of the knowledge that could otherwise be built up in the public sector is drained and is taken on by private contractors who may not work again for the public sector and take that knowledge offshore. That can also lead to a loss of wealth in local economies because those contracts don't necessarily go into local jobs, a point that was made by Troy Brookbank, an engineer who we spoke to, and who has particular expertise in Māori engineering. We haven't seen innovation. In fact, studies highlight the particular lack of innovation in the construction sector, and we've seen problems with health and safety. So Jim knew, and a number of examples about that. So we wanted to have a debate about this, and we thought these were two clear problems. I'll throw it over to Jackie to talk about the third and fourth problems we identified.
Cool. So firstly, just want to speak to the first one, which is the problem conditions of work. And I'm sure this is not unfamiliar to many, but the very, the severe need in terms of the shortage of workers in the sector. And this was really new to me as well. I'm really understanding, working alongside First Union, just understanding some of the issues that workers are facing. Actually, majority of my family, perhaps 3 generations are all in construction, and so I should probably have known a bit more about this, but it was really alarming just to learn that, and it's just something that we actually speak about in the report as well, just highlighting the shortage of workers, and then emphasize that there's little incentive for project-based contractors to provide longer term training for the people that it employs and subcontracts essentially. So what that means is that builders, for example, can work for years on low wages without getting qualified via existing apprenticeship programs. We also highlight poor health and safety in the construction sector, including an alarming 11 deaths in 2019 coming into COVID, which is a 10-year high. And again, just learning all these things, just for myself anyway, is how is this okay, right? And so being able to think about the impact that this research can contribute to highlighting some of these issues has been really informative. And it's not, again, I'm not an expert in this area, and I'm sure many of you will have, your own experiences across the sector. And I'm sure Ed can answer some more questions, perhaps in our Q&A about the severity of this issue. And there are many things that we probably couldn't have covered in just this one report, but I hope that being able to contribute to improving these conditions through the establishment of the Ministry of Green Works. So you can read more in that report. I'll quickly go through the second one, the problem of coordination to tackle climate change. As we know, we are in a housing crisis, but we're also in a climate crisis as well, and the urgency is now. So we debate this topic in terms of the current government response, or no response, and what this may look like within the housing and infrastructure space. So, for example, one of the quotes that we highlight specifically in the report, the government may be pulling many of the levers it has available on climate change and infrastructure and housing, but there needs to be a questioning about, whether these levers are adequate and whether the government needs to expand the available levers that it has to pursue anything, in order to approach this idea of an Aotearoa Green New Deal, which is an ambitious system-wide government-led approach to tackling climate change that can simultaneously achieve other social and economic goals. Because the system is so fragmented and obviously so highly political, I don't think they're doing enough, and especially in this space. But I also think that there's an opportunity for, innovation to be able to think about and propose solutions, actually, how we can do this through the vehicle of a Ministry of Green Works. So it's great to see some of the pilot actually that Kainga Ora are doing at a very small scale, but I think we can expand on some of those types of things. That's in terms of normalizing essentially the way in which we practice and deliver. So we also propose that the time's come to revisit whether a new architecture of public institutions need to be introduced afresh to create new green jobs and meet the challenges of the 21st century. We can't emphasize enough the need for coordination across the sector. So housing, infrastructure, and climate change, it's all interconnected. And so we need to think about this as an ecosystem, essentially, in the way in which they intersect, the way in which they interact, and the way in which they inform and deliver, not only just public housing, but better places and better communities that are all, climate responsive and strengthen our communities in terms of resilience. So I don't know, I feel like it is kind of exciting. And I think the time is now for these types of conversations. So let's hope we're able to continue to build this momentum and mobilize our communities to, really collectively work together to push for change. So, hi, over to Max. Oh, is that me or was that you?
I think it's still you, Jackie.
Oh, okay. So where are we now? Go back.
Okay,
so we've dealt with all the issues that we've got. Now, I think it's really good. Let's move on to planning for the future and really being ambitious and aspirational. And what does that look like? So through this process, we've proposed, or actually we've developed a set of values thanks to Vanessa's guidance around actually thinking about the values that guide our priorities and think about the response to such issues. So in order to judge the effectiveness of our proposal, we set out the values as stated, and it can be judged against as well. So to put another way, when judging whether a policy idea works, it's important to explain what it actually means for this policy to work, for whom and against what benchmarks. So we suggest these 7 values as an appropriate guide, and we draw on them from our own experience and expertise within housing and infrastructure policy. So the first one is whakamana te tiriti o Waitangi, and essentially we really just speak about honouring te tiriti o Waitangi in both power and resources and in both spheres, because actually housing and infrastructure is such a treaty issue for all parties, for both partners, because yes, for a long time it's, Māori have been always essentially at the end of the barrel, but now it's, it's many across Aotearoa. The next one is manaki whenua, manaki tangata, and essentially it's really just understanding the relationship between land and people, and essentially recentering land in the conversation. And this kind of idea is that if the land is well, the people are also well. And really, it's not at the moment if we understand our environment that continues to degrade. So how do we change that philosophy to really shape and change our thinking so that it changes our minds, hearts, and the way in which we work as well? The next one is Indigenous innovation. So we really speak about this kind of idea of decolonising architecture and proposing innovative solutions that invest in understanding practice to improve the way we do things, whether that is in construction methods, resource management, and really think about this long-term and intergenerational planning. What do you want to see for your grandchildren, right, or your children in terms of the places that we live? So there's an opportunity to think about what that looks like, especially in the unique context of Aotearoa. And I think we're quite, the creative people. Let's harness that, local knowledge and expertise and the skills and people that we have in our communities. So we could go on for days for that one, but I'll carry on. So thinking about collaboration and coordination, I think this is really self-explanatory in terms of a systems approach to respond to the significant housing infrastructure and climate changes. The next one is creativity. Really, let's harness that knowledge, thinking about revering from traditional market-oriented approaches and try new things and explore, what might work, whether it is different knowledge systems, how can we work together to really address such gaps, and just really shape our environment and being able to contribute to that. The next one is safety and accessibility, so really focusing on people and working conditions. And the last one is really just around change as part of the wider economic transformation. Thinking about this broader economic change that is required and how we adapt and change given the challenges. I think we're quite adaptive and flexible people, and really challenging these ideas, whether it's the decommodification of assets and reassessing the way in which we value things, especially housing and infrastructure, understanding that as taonga, as kainga, and really just changing the way in which you just see things in its place, because it's not working and we need to acknowledge that and really just shift that. So won't provide an overview, but that essentially is what guides our priorities in this report and sets the foundation of what the Ministry of Green Work seeks to aspire and embody.
Yeah, and so coming then on to kind of what we proposed, and we'll kind of aim to wrap this up in the next sort of 10 or so minutes. Realize everyone's been on a lot of Zoom calls, but so we looked at the past, looked at the lessons from the past, looked at kind of problems in the present, developed some values to think about what the right response is, and then wanted to ask, okay, so what can solve these 4 problems and be consistent with these 4 values? And some people might say that it might be enough to kind of tweak the current system. So for example, couldn't the government change its procurement practices so that procurement specifies health and safety more clearly, specifies the need for innovation, specifies the need to honour Te Tiriti o Waitangi. Now the problem with that approach is, first of all, it's already been tried. There have been changes to government procurement in recent years. Secondly, it's not mutually exclusive to change procurement and to do other things. But most fundamentally, the problem isn't how goals have been specified in contracts. The problem, we think, is with the model of contracting itself. So we didn't think tweaking procurement practices was enough. We thought we need a step change. And what we propose is a new public entity, a Ministry of Green Works. And what we mean by that public entity, or what we have in mind, is an entity that directly builds housing and infrastructure and directly employs core staff for that purpose. We really wanted this to be consistent with Te Tiriti o Waitangi, and so inspired by thinking in the Mātika Mai Aotearoa report, we wanted to think in terms of a kāwanatanga sphere, a crown sphere, and a tino rangatiratanga sphere. That's just Articles 1 and 2 of Te Tiriti o Waitangi. And so our proposal was you have a Ministry of Green Works, and then you also at the same time have significant resourcing for Māori to build housing and infrastructure, again, directly. There's some funding, including in the recent budget, for Māori housing, but it's very limited, as Jade Kake and others have said. And we think this does address all 4 problems that we identified and carries other benefits as well. I won't go through this in a lot of detail now, because I do want to talk a little bit about what it would look like and some other points, but just in brief, could boost capacity. If the capacity is limited at the moment by workforce and the underlying kind of profit imperatives, our view is that directly employing staff, bringing in training programs that the old Ministry of Works had, removing profit margins so that you don't pay dividends, but you're able to reinvest back into the public entity, having economies of scale, so you can brigade together materials and buy in bulk, that all of those things would boost capacity. On addressing the problems of contracting out, this is kind of obvious by definition. What we're proposing is not ending contracting out across the board, but removing the extent of contracting out by having this new public entity, and addressing these problems by not having these legal and consulting costs, keeping know-how in-house, coordinating, as Jackie said. So rather than having, the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Health having different approaches to building, having one body that oversees the approach, committing to core health and safety practices, having better accountability, and starting to shrink how much market approaches are dominating housing and infrastructure. And that's what we mean when we talk about decommodifying. So taking housing and infrastructure out of being seen as a commodity, which you do by starting to shrink that market sphere. We think we improve training and conditions at work by providing more security through public jobs, improving training and cadetship programs, having clearer pathways, including for women and others who have not been served well. One interesting thing was talking to Ganesh Nana, who's at the Productivity Commission, who was supportive, and he said there was in particular a role potentially for ensuring workforce capacity. And lastly, we thought this would address coordination problems by having a body with greater powers, and having a body that can think together about housing and infrastructure and climate change. Other benefits as well here, in particular, and this is one point to pause on, I think we're going to see more and more natural disasters, unfortunately, and crises in our society going forward. And we're going to need a government that is nimble enough to adapt. And we thought that a body like a Ministry of Green Works could play a role in adapting in functions in response to urgent needs. So whether those needs are building protection for coastal areas affected by flooding, or building a mandatory isolation facility, a public mandatory isolation facility in response to a pandemic. We thought this could better honour Te Tiriti o Waitangi, provide some certainty for the private sector by creating a pipeline of jobs and training. And then we in particular wanted to talk about public housing and green infrastructure, and I'm going to come on to that now. So our proposed structure, as I've said, was a Ministry of Green Works in the Crown sphere, this Tino Rangatiratanga sphere, and we actually got into quite a lot of detail about what this would look like. And we had this quite detailed chart put together for us by Peter Rice and Tamayo Stewart. And essentially what we propose is 3 arms. So a design arm, construction arm, and an oversight arm. So key to this is direct construction. That's that middle arm there, where you'd have offsite and onsite teams, an engineer in chief, which the old Ministry of Works had. But we really wanted this to be tied to the thing on the left, the design arm, having architecture in-house. Some of the greatest examples of public housing historically have involved partnerships between really great architects and the public sector, including in London. I lived close to some really great examples of council housing developed in this way. We think urban design is as important here as architecture. We also wanted an oversight arm, that's what you have on the right there, which could think about planning, maintenance and repairs, use of land, setting standards, and also thinking about the future strategy and policy. And we wanted 2 missions, or 2 kind of focus areas for this Ministry of Green Works: green infrastructure and public housing. Vanessa can talk a little bit more about public housing and what the need is and what could be done. And actually Vanessa did some really amazing work in this report looking at how many houses might be built. On the green infrastructure side, we focused in particular on rail, and we thought that if this government was serious, or future governments were serious about an integrated public transport network, that building out the rail network at scale could be done by the Ministry of Green Works. And we talked to Andre Brett, who recently wrote a book on rail, and he felt that the Ministry of Green Works could do things like building out passenger rail to Tauranga, Napier, connecting places like Huntly and Morrinsville, or Ashburton and Timaru, and providing a spine for a bus network as well, so that you have kind of real choice and a multimodal vision. So that's the design that we had in mind. The focus areas, having standing capacity to be flexible. And an important point relevant to some of Ed's work, in particular on forestry, is that we think the Ministry of Green Works needs to be connected to training and a training strategy, but also a materials strategy, where we can think more overtly in New Zealand about materials that are being used. And so thinking about what's done with mills and keeping mills open so that mills can supply wood and other products for and timber products for a Ministry of Greenworks. We also wanted to talk about how this doesn't have to be a top-down ministry, how regional and local officers, iwi and hapu, could be involved, and we could have a representative board, and that's covered at the kind of top of this diagram. Just in terms of implementation and delivery, I'm going to pass back over to Jackie just before we wrap up, but we wanted to be really practical here. So we said, government wants to do this, it would need legislation. We also think you should have a minister for Greenworks. Ideally, the person who's also the Minister for Infrastructure, who is Grant Robertson. And we also thought it was really important that this isn't a kind of arm's length ministry or a crown entity, an arm's length crown entity or an arm's length state-owned enterprise, but actually a new ministry that is a part of the public service. Throw it back to Jackie to talk about the key relationships.
Yeah, so just briefly just want to speak to the institutional arrangements and the current institutional frameworks in housing and infrastructure, and will be critical in terms of thinking about cross-agency and cross-sectoral responses. And the reality is that the system needs to be coordinated and more integrated in the way in which it functions. So it will be interesting to see and learn from some of the recommendations that come out, firstly, not only from the Y2570, the tribunal, in terms of the housing inquiry that has been undertaken at the moment. So first stage is just completed, and also in terms of some of the learnings that will come out of the National Housing Inquiry from the Human Rights Commission, and some of those learnings, especially around the institutional gaps and how we, again, understand that housing is a human right. But also it's, there is a lot going on, but the reality is that people want homes, not more policy documents, not more of these other programs that actually don't address this need. Notwithstanding actually some of the really good things that are, that have been carried out in terms of institutional reforms, more specifically, the notable ones are really around Kainga Order and the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development, and more specifically a lot of more Māori that are leading in a lot of those leadership programs. So it's really good to see representation there. I think we definitely need to be able to work with the infrastructure sector to collaborate, because it's so, again, fragmented, both housing and infrastructure. And that it is, and I've heard someone else say this, but it's about collaboration and not competition, essentially. So let's think about ways in which we do that. And I can really speak about multiple things, but I am conscious of time. So yeah, a lot of important kind of things to note, but relationships will be critical and essential to all the things that we do if this is, developed. So yeah, definitely should be at the forefront.
So if you raised this in a conversation now, that Ministry of Greenworks might be a good idea, one question that might come up would be, how much will it cost? And won't that be a massive cost blowout? And we looked carefully at this, and we did think government would have to borrow for this. And actually the government's debt at the moment is very low. It's being encouraged to borrow. And what we did was we asked an economist, Wilbur Townsend, to look at some costings. And what was quite interesting was that Wilbur compared the sometimes quite high profit margins in the private construction sector with the likely costs of a public project. And he suggested that a Ministry of Greenworks could pay for itself over 14 to 21 years just by removing those profit margins. And he took into account some factors and made some assumptions. But yeah, the idea was you save 7 to 12 cents in every dollar spent when you remove that need to make profit and to pay shareholder dividends. Another question that might come up is, could the government really do this? The government's not very nimble. The government is very risk averse. And we also thought really hard about this. And we spoke to someone, Lucy Mary Mulholland, about how you shift culture. And one thing that really came out of other conversations as well was the need for this ministry to be expert-led and to have a culture of experimentation, to be cooperative with other entities so that it's not competitive, and to be long-term in its thinking. We had some suggestions for how to do that. We did also look at a number of other risks. And so I would really recommend having a look at this report, because we tried to make it a kind of a set of tools that you could take away and having a conversation about this. Pass it over to Jackie to touch on this before we conclude.
Yeah, so as stated, these are some of the possible arguments against the policy proposal, and especially around setting up the entity. And a lot of the concerns are valid, criticisms. So I think it was a really great approach to be able to state that in the report and identify these 12 key risks. I won't again speak to all of them given the time constraints, but I think by challenging the proposal, it really sets out that thinking of what will work, what could work, what might not work. And really, I think allows for many other people who might engage in this work just to try and understand the thought process as well that we've kind of gone through. And I'm sure many people will ask these anyway. So for example, it might be around te tere tio waitangi. How do we address, some of the harm that colonisation has done, and ensuring that that's at the forefront. And it's about putting these into public debate and thinking about some of the low trust models, actually, the way in which the current system practices. So it could be difficult, when speaking about relationships. So there's a lot to unpack, and perhaps it might be something, on some of your guys' minds around these that we could perhaps have a further discussion. But I think that, we hope that this proposal would make clear, and I'm using the example of te tere tio waitangi, how that is normalised in our processes, and that it's more recently being adopted in housing and infrastructure policy. And so being able to build on that and understanding just the complexities as well, for responding to this. So won't speak to those because I would love to be able to have that discussion and unpack some of that, but they're all detailed in the report as well. So a lot to kind of get through, but all valid concerns that I'm sure many will have some questions about.
Yeah, lots of people to thank, and just to say this was a real team effort. And just in closing, I think a real impulse behind this was kind of thinking about what Sid Kepper said about how success has become an individual idea. A real impulse was like reclaiming ambition as a collective value, as something that's not just a value that is played out when individuals do really well, but it's something that we realize when we undertake projects as a community that we can all be proud of. And I think at the moment we're seeing a really interesting kind of lull in progressive activism. I think there was a big surge of imaginative thinking early in the pandemic. When we heard that the idea of the pandemic as a portal, but there's this lull at the moment, and that's relevant because we hope that this is the kind of idea that might kickstart conversations. And when we look back, I think we've got a choice. Like, will we look back at this time, drawing on what Ed said, and think, this was a time when we got more unequal and we didn't do anything to try to kind of re-inject solidarity? Or will we look back at this time and say, actually, this was a moment, perhaps like some moments in the past, some crisis moments in the past, when we strengthened solidarity and we built new institutions? That choice is still in our hands, but we actually need to be specific about what we demand. And we think this is one of the specific ideas that could be put forward. It's not a comprehensive blueprint, but as Jackie said, it's a start for conversations. We want to get to questions, but I'm just going to throw it over to Vanessa Cole because we really didn't want this report just to lie on a shelf. And Vanessa has been involved with lots of amazing housing activism, as well as housing research. She's got several articles, as well as contributing to this report. And I'm going to throw over to Vanessa, who's just going to talk about some campaigns and the public housing dimension of this, just for a few minutes, and then we'll have time for questions. So Vanessa, let me throw it over to you.
Kia ora koutou. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Kia ora, my name's Vanessa, and I'm from a group called Public Housing Futures, who are starting to work towards an organising campaign focused on public housing, that's state and council housing, as a solution to the housing crisis for people and for the planet. I've been involved in state housing action for a long time and was involved with the Tamaki Housing Group, who we're fighting against the state-led gentrification process that was happening in Glen Innes, a model that we continue to see today in many suburbs across Aotearoa. I witnessed the violence of what urban and housing policy, which centres the private market over the wellbeing of people, can do to a community. But I also learned the real importance of state housing for communities when it is secure and maintained. I've also been involved with Auckland Action Against Poverty for many years, and we see the coldface of what the disinvestment in state housing has done for many people and families who are living in emergency accommodation because of high rents and gentrification, pushing them from their homes and their communities. And lastly, I'm a renter myself, and I strongly believe in a move towards decommodifying housing, moving away from private landlords and individual home ownership. And I think public housing is one of the essential things to do this. As people have mentioned already, like as Max mentioned before, public housing waitlist is over 24,000, but the real need for public housing stretches beyond this waitlist, especially if we consider that 350,000 people rely on accommodation supplement to afford their rent. The need for public housing is expensive because the private market has failed people for generations. And it's time for the government to invest in a mass build of public housing to house the wait list and then expand access for all people, no matter what their income is. So moving from a residualized system that public housing currently is to a more universal one. And as many of you will also know, 50% of the public housing waitlist is Māori. And this means that alongside public housing, the government must finance and enable hapu iwi and marae to build housing solutions for and by Māori. I'm just going to talk about some of the main reasons why we're fighting for public housing as a solution. Firstly, public housing is truly affordable. People in public housing pay income-related rents, though as we've seen with the income-related rents for all campaign in Wellington, this isn't always the case. Public housing rent is determined by policy as opposed to a land market. So when private landlords increase your rent in a particular area, people in public housing, their rent will stay the same. So public housing also makes other housing around it more affordable if there's an abundance of public housing in an area. This brings me to my second point. Public housing really protects communities against economic forces, against gentrification, and provides secure tenure and a sense of community connection. While successive governments have not demonstrated this quality, the first Labour government did intend it to be a secure tenure for life, just as good as home ownership. Thirdly, public housing could be well designed to be beautiful, sustainable, fully accessible, culturally competent, and part of the communities that they're built in, particularly if there was a Ministry of Green Works where the government was directly building housing with good union jobs, good planning and urban design, and honouring te tiriti in this. And lastly, public housing is a democratic essential service. So this means that those in power are accountable to the people. Just like hospitals and schools, housing should be a public service that we own collectively. And this means more democratic things like tenant and neighbourhood unions need to be a part of this. A lot of these points are kind of talking about what public housing should be. And we want to acknowledge as a group that in our campaign that public housing has not always been good for everyone. It has been a part of ongoing colonisation and land theft. It has been under-maintained, disinvested in and residualised. But that's where we really think this public housing futures come in. We as a group have been talking about a new kind of public housing, which takes all the good elements from the past, but ensures that it is secure, democratic, green, upholds te tiriti, and provides a hopeful alternative for generations to come. So Public Housing Futures is a group of young people who have backgrounds in unions, community organising, research and housing activism, who instead of being disillusioned by rising house prices, want to fight for an alternative that is bolder and better. We're at the beginning stages of this, so I'm not providing a whole bunch of details, but if you follow us on Twitter, and we will be putting out more opportunities to get involved in the new year. We really believe in the importance of organising together on the ground to build a base of people fighting for decommodified housing futures. It's really clear that the government does not currently have the political will to make bold changes in the housing space, and would rather kind of offset responsibility to the private market through pouring money into emergency housing providers, landlords and developers. And it's important to acknowledge that this kind of organising and fight for public housing is not new. It's built off a history of housing struggles locally and globally, with many of those involved in this group coming from spaces of organising with communities on the ground. There has also been other groups around the country that have formed recently. I want to shout out to the Income Related Rents for All campaign, led by council tenants in Wellington, and all the state tenant-led groups that have formed over the years in resistance to the cutbacks of state housing. There is an importance for us to work alongside unions and beneficiary groups to fight for public housing, for teachers to live close to their schools, for nurses to be close to their hospitals, and for all workers, paid and unpaid, to have access to housing close to their networks and their amenities. We cannot win this without building a base of people demanding public housing future that represents their own dreams for their communities. There's a lot of work to do, but I think people are really kind of ready to put their power behind alternatives. They just need to be supported to realise their own power to make change happen. I just want to thank everyone for the opportunity to just give a little talk around public housing, and for all the work that Jackie and Max and First Union do in their communities to fight for transformation in this space. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. That was amazing. I really appreciate that. And you made a lot of references to future activity, and by all means, come back to us when you've got some of that stuff is in development, and talk to Fabians again. It'll be very useful to hear from you. Max, do you have a final statement before we open up questions? I see we've got a couple there already. No? Okay, Sean, do you want to ask your question? You've been patient.
Sure, Max and Jacqueline and Edward. I've got a couple of questions regarding funding. A Ministry of Green Works will require a lot of money. Can I get your thoughts about Stephanie Kelton's comment about modern monetary theory, or MMT, that a sovereign government can no more run out of money than a school board can run out of numbers? And also, in the lead up to the 2016 or 2017 election, you wrote a paper with Sebastian Biarima about basic income. Can I ask why that is no longer possible to find online, and why the coverage on YouTube is no longer present? And this is with reference to the Grant Robertson's pre-budget speech in May 2020, where he talked about, rebuilding back better. It seemed to be a lot more closer, a lot more feasible entering the discussion than it was previously. So I would just get your brief thoughts about that. Thank you. And also, Edward, maybe if you could talk about the First Union's policy approach to basic income. Thank you.
Max.
Sure, I'll jump in. Thanks, Sean. Those are great questions. I didn't know the basic income paper wasn't available online anymore. Yeah, I support it. I think there's a good case for a basic income pilot. I, like Vanessa, think that universal basic services are probably like the bigger priority in my view, especially after what we've seen in how much we all rely on public services in COVID. And I've also done a bit of work on universal basic services or universal essential services and Auckland Action Against Poverty, and others pushed. And this is just a way of framing free public services. It's not necessarily inconsistent with universal basic income, but to me, I think it's possibly a greater priority at the moment, though I would like to see kind of more discussions about UBI as well. Just on MMT, sorry to disappoint potentially, but I'm personally not completely sold on MMT. We could have a longer discussion. What I do agree with is that with some points that are made by kind of MMT advocates, which is that the government can take on much more debt, that there's a good case for government spending. I do think that Stephanie Kelton's work has been like really helpful in contributing to less scaremongering about government debt and seeing the importance of government spending and the fact that it's less constrained. yeah, we probably would be going down into kind of a slightly technical debate, but I'd be happy to kind of continue the conversation with you about MMT. And I do think Stephanie Kelson's made some really interesting contributions to policymaking, including on the Bernie Sanders campaign. Ed, did you want to chip in on this?
Yeah, I guess I'm maybe a bit more sympathetic to MMT than Max. I don't think it's a panacea, but I think particularly at a time when you have very low unemployment and a labour market that's working it's very, very tight. I think there's kind of evidence that there is capacity for a little bit of money printing to be able to keep the economy moving in effective ways. I think needs to be set in contrast to the kind of quantitative easing that we've seen through the COVID crisis, where that $50 billion was effectively given out to banks to throw into the housing market. It needs, if we're going to do this kind of initiative, it needs to go into addressing fundamental social needs, some of the deficits that we see in health, education, housing, etc. And then just on the basic income question, I'm pretty sympathetic to it, but I think I'm always concerned that it would be much too low, and that any kind of basic income would just end up being a lobbying tool for the same kind of business interests that lobby against decent minimum wages, that lobby against decent benefits and all that kind of a thing. So it's a really nice idea, but I think the access to power in terms of the political engagement to be able to get to that point is the struggle. Being able to get working people to find power to be able to put policies in place is actually what we need to have. The program will fall into place after that. My own personal view.
Thank you.
Rosemary, you're next up there with your hand up. Anybody else wants to ask a question, just do the old flicking with the hand. Thank you. Thanks, Rosemary, you're on.
Thank you. Kia ora koutou. Greetings from Aotearoa, Christchurch. When I read about the Green Ministry of Works, I'm famous in my friends for just reading a heading and getting, wow, that is so exciting. So that's one thing. I just have a couple of questions and comments. The first one is, after the earthquakes in Christchurch, there was a very innovative program called the SCIRT program to rebuild our infrastructure and pipes. And the people who worked on that it was a way of actually using the major infrastructure companies who agreed to bypass disaster capitalism and actually agree to working together to collaborate, to work with communities to solve this complex problem that we had in Christchurch. And I think that there's a lot of really good learnings from that, Max and Jacqueline, that is really worth, and I can put you in touch with some of the people. They haven't actually written it up much, but it's called Engage, and it's a particularly could work in this situation, particularly before the big picture of the Green Ministry of Works. So anyway, I'm happy to give you some information about that. The second thing that I'm very nervous about at present is the tendency towards national solutions for problems. I see this in the RMA, the Three Waters, the health, and it on one level you can kind of see it an argument, but on the other hand, we need more local solutions than that. And I saw a hint that maybe you are trying to go down that way, but I feel like when we talk about iwi and solutions, that's fantastic. But at that same level, we need to talk about regional and local solutions and not get back into this kind of top-down, Wellington-driven solution. So I'm nervous about that. So I'm interested in how you might approach that. The third thing, Vanessa, we should talk about public housing. You didn't mention the community housing network, and that's something I'm involved in a lot, and that struggles to get serious funding and is local, community driven, and doesn't have the risk of being sold off if there's a change of government. So that's the other thing that I wanted to raise. Thank you very much.
Max, I thought maybe you want to give them a brief overview in terms of the kind of decentralized idea of regional,
Sure. And then I can throw it back to you, Jackie and Vanessa, maybe. So we did. Thanks a lot for those questions, Rosemary. And just to say, yeah, we wanted it to be exciting. And Louisa from First said, you know, that she wanted this to be something that gave people some hope in kind of bleak times. And that was, yeah, so I'm really glad to hear that. But yeah, we actually talked in the paper about where the ministry might be set up. We said there's actually no reason the headquarters should be in Wellington, and you might think about putting the headquarters in Northland or Christchurch. We actually mentioned that in the paper. And yeah, we think it's really important that there are kind of regional offices and yeah, local forms of accountability. We mentioned this, there's an idea in Paris called the Paris Water Observatory, which is about ways of local citizens being involved. So we definitely tried to integrate those ideas, and Skirt came up in our interviews, and also some of those Christchurch responses as ways that involved like direct government building. But I would like to read more. So yeah, would love to hear from you if you hear more along those lines. Yeah, I think that's enough from me. Maybe throw it to Jackie or Vanessa.
No, I was just going to say about the skirt stuff that you thought might mentioned, and I think just noting the political kind of will at that time and the legislative frameworks that had kind of fast-tracked a lot of these things that happen, different kind of political contexts as well. So yeah, no, perhaps Ness, you got anything?
I guess I want to address like this. There is like these tensions between like state control and community control, and also in this context in Aotearoa, thinking about how that connects in with the tino tiratanga sphere. And I think with, I do have some reservations and concerns around the growth of the community housing sector. And I separate the community housing sector out from the Māori housing sector, and that a lot of it is being kind of managed by like charities. And I think that we need to move away from a model of charity housing to something that we have collective ownership over. I acknowledge that there's lots of community housing groups that are doing amazing work, and yeah, I'm happy to have more conversations about it, but I just have a few reservations about the sector and the move that National gave to try to offset the responsibility of the state to house people onto already under-resourced communities. Yeah.
Yeah, I might just quickly add something, and it's something that I saw in the UK as well. And actually, many of the community housing providers ended up moving to very profit-driven models because it was so unsustainable in the current ones that they're functioning. And then I think the other example is when obviously the transfer of some of our social housing stock to some of those community housing providers haven't actually been able to maintain the stock, look after the people that they've got, and meet the dire needs. So yeah, there is a lot of tension, but I think there's still opportunity for collaboration. So working with iwi, and I think what isn't often discussed is around land as well, and the retaining of that. So it might not be, you know, it doesn't have to be state or Crown and Māori. Actually, it can be community and Māori, you know, iwi hapu, perhaps, and that just resource, you know, state, give the resource, redistribute, let our communities do what they know what they can do. So yeah, I think we just need to kind of rethink some of those mechanics as well.
Thank you, Jackie. Gary, you're next to the line. Gary.
Yes. Yes, I go along with a lot of the issues that people have just been discussing. I think it's great to be able to review the contracting, the privatization that we've been submitted to, and looking at the problems. Of course, the public sector has had a lot of problems too, and so we really need to be very aware of the problems of the public sector and understand those to ensure that we don't print that. You've got the centralisation, natural centralisation, bureaucracy that grows very naturally. And then you're talking about communities. Communities have their strengths and weaknesses, particularly when they start getting rather large. And the management of power within the communities can be very fraught with problems. And then there's the private sector that can be very innovative, and very locally related and also have a lot of contributions to make. So flexibility is going to be really key.
Thank you, Gary. Not quite sure whether there was a question in there, but any response?
Yeah, well, the question is how to ensure that what is set up has got the flexibility to be responsive and ensure that community does not imply uniformity.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds to me like you need to make sure that we have a fully unionized Ministry of Green Work that is organized by a working class union that respects the demands of working class people. That's maybe slightly jokey kind of comment, but I do think those are major concerns. At the same time as having the privatization and hollowing out of a lot of the public sphere, you have in some ways now the public sector operates like the private sector anyway, and a lot of internal work that has been done historically by the public sector is now effectively done by accounting firms in the guise of acting like public sector, or public sector officials acting in the guise of accounting firms. So I think, you know, in the paper, there's a bit of a discussion about culture, and I think that's got to be an ongoing discussion as well, making sure that the ministry has the right culture to be able to tackle problems in a way that's not sort of old and dried and you know, that kind of thing, but that there's innovation there and willingness to change and adapt to new situations, and respect that from time to time that the private sector will have important contributions that should be funneled in an appropriate manner to being able to address those problems.
Maybe just to add, yeah, I agree with what Ed said, but I do think we have a housing and infrastructure system that's out of balance at the moment, that is, yeah, too focused on relying on the private sector, which has been shown not to provide, especially for low-income people, including and other people. I mean, yeah, one thing we talked about was accessible housing. We talked to Huhana Hiki and about how much of the private market is not providing for disabled people who want to be in homes. And I think that, yeah, really we're talking about kind of rebalancing that. And yeah, totally agree with your concerns, but I do think there's a role for arguing for a different kind of state again. And there's an economist called Mariana Mazzucato who's done some really good work on how actually the state has been innovative. We've been telling stories about private sector innovation and forgetting how the state at times has done really amazing things. And I guess we just think there's a need to emphasize that, given how much we've gotten out of balance.
I'd agree with that, Nick. Certainly that we've also forgotten how much the community can be trusted with its intelligence and its capacity to determine its own future, and the skill sets that are needed to sustain that. Thanks very much. Robert, I think you might be our last question by the look of it. Robert Howe.
Okay, my understanding of part of the problem of the housing is that there are far too many players and they're too small. And if you look at some of the overseas models, there's a lot of work done pre-site on factories and modular designs, and you just churn them out. And that requires, the bulk, if you do that in bulk, not necessarily one design, but a multitude of designs, but you can then really reduce the costs and cut out a lot of the middlemen that contribute to. That's really, I mean, you talked about, I think it was collaboration and consolidation and using the buying power of the state, but this is really looking at getting factories in parts of the country like Auckland and Wellington where the major need is, and ensuring that those really are significant in terms of scale to be able to really crack that one. Now, you didn't actually spell that out, but I'm assuming that's sort of behind that sort of brief bullet point.
Jackie, do you want to take that, or I'm happy to speak?
Yes, the answer is yes. Yes, huge fan in terms of being able to test, some of the opportunities around prefabrication within the kind of local context, which is why I think there's an opportunity to be able to establish the design and architecture lens as well, developing, some of these what's the best way to say, models or plans essentially, and when you're working with planning teams, being able to get them out for consent and stuff like that. So you have that like technical knowledge and expertise in-house, because right now, even that is in the private sector, right? We outsource essentially a lot of that expertise. But if we can do that in-house, and at scale, and with innovation and working, developing materials strategies and those who have local supplies across the sector, then we won't have to kind of think about the kind of supply issues that we do have and being able to scale up. So yeah, I would love to be able to think about how we do that and normalize the process. Also in terms of the climate change, just thinking about, pre-production issues, pre-production around lower carbon emissions. And so I think there's a lot of kind of exciting opportunities to explore, the approaches that you've spoken about.
Maybe just that, sorry, Robert.
Well, there must be lots of examples overseas that you could draw on to convince the right-wing skeptics here that, it's already been done. You're not reinventing the wheel.
And examples from our own history. So yeah, we do talk about house building factories in the report, and the New Zealand Railways Corporation had a factory in the early 20th century, which we touch on. And yes, I totally agree with you that there's that idea of scale. And as Jackie said, Kāinga Order has been moving to prefabricated homes, but they're still outsourcing it. So they're still contracting that out and adding cost and delay by doing this overseas, and then asking those homes to be kind of transported to New Zealand, rather than setting up, as you say, factories that can do modular construction or construction at scale here. So yeah, definitely agree with the drift of what you're saying, and I think it's covered in the report.
And if I could just add, from a labour point of view, in-house construction or housing factories, whatever you want to call it, is a lot safer for workers. It's a lot easier for unions to organise. Generally, you have most workers employed by the same company, so you don't have the issues of multi-level subcontracting. And yeah, I think there's just so many examples of I was going to say, in fact, right now, Clevercore, which is a Fletcher's-owned modular construction company, we just a couple of months ago secured a 22% wage increase there. It is a lot easier to organise in these situations, and we're doing it effectively. We have a traditional frame and truss industry in Aotearoa, but the establishment of that into a more systematic kind of industrialised building system is probably in the pipeline, regardless of whether there's a Ministry of Works in front of it. So I think it's an important challenge for unions and for those of us involved in those kind of challenges to be thinking about how we make sure it's a Ministry of Green Works doing it rather than Fletcher's.
We've got 2 minutes to squeeze in the final question and an answer. Hayne, is it, from Auckland?
Sorry. Yes, sorry, my title says M. It just gives my email address. It's Michael.
Michael, hi Mike. Can just
okay? Can I speak? Yes. Can I just add a footnote to what's been said? Absolutely, prefabrication is crucial. But what hasn't actually been mentioned in this discussion is the essential point that there is no way we can build our way out of the inadequate supply of housing that we have at the moment without looking at multi-family housing complexes. And I mean, not just extended family complexes, but really substantial ones. And I think of the example of a city like Vienna in Austria, where they just have the most wonderful large-scale housing complexes, sort of four stories, 5 stories, something like that, green space around them, preschool facilities, swimming pools, etc., attached to them as rental accommodation. In the city of Vienna, only 29% of people own their own home. They don't think it's necessary because the provision, largely by the city, but also by what are called limited profit housing associations, the facilities that they have built and continue to build just are so much more satisfactory than all of us living in little separate boxes.
Thank you, Michael. That's a very good example. Is there a response to that?
Maybe just quickly, yeah, really support the notion of multi or intergenerational family. But again, the current market, and many of you know, in terms of housing typologies, and confined by space and profit and what they can get in essentially. So huge influence, but a lot of opportunities to rethink some of these housing typologies, given that we have standard ones in terms of public housing at the moment. Same in the private sector, especially if they're done by builders directly, they use the same plans. Will tend to use the same plans as well, which aren't inherently flexible or adaptable. So I think there's a lot of exploration in that. So yeah, that I'm happy to have a side conversation, but a huge advocate for intergenerational housing.
And just really quickly, sorry, Vanessa wrote this little section in the report about public housing and talked about Vienna. And so, yeah, totally agree about Vienna being a great example of different forms of public housing. Sorry, Phil.
There you go. No, that's fine. That's a good example. I appreciate those too. I've wandered around Vienna. It's amazing. Hey, everyone, thank you so much. This has been a very enlightening session. It's amazing that we get a public policy paper that's sponsored the way this one has. It's got a good whakapapa. It's got a great presence in the community already, and I hope it continues to grow. I do tend to agree with Max's comment that the optimism within the progressive side of politics at the moment is taking a bit of a battering, perhaps not entirely because our ideas are wrong, or just because the tenor of the debate is a bit curmudgeonly at the moment, and there is a volatile opposition out there trying to say something obscure about freedom and so on. On the other hand, we always did think that this would be an opportunity for change, and we want that change to be green-based. We want it to be justice-based. We want it to be transformative. And I think everyone here is part of that process. And I really appreciate the work and effort that you've all put in to making this a successful evening. And I hope you all have a safe and, well, I hope you have I was going to say a safe journey home, but of course we're not journeying home now. We're just going through to the kitchen and grabbing our tea out of the oven. So thank you very much, everybody, and welcome. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks so much, everyone.
Mm.